Well, thanks very much for being here. My name is Dina Gusejnova, and I'm here with Esme Cleall. We are going to be talking about fabrics, but also fabrication in kind of various senses. One sense of fabrication could be plotting a story, another sense could be connecting ideas to people.
And also kind of connecting different histories, different national histories together. So you're going to start?
Yeah, I'm going to start. We're going to talk about two very common fabrics, one of which probably most of you have somewhere in the garden, and that's tarpaulin. One of the things that got me thinking about tarpaulin is actually a very academic thing. I'm normally working on the history of ideas, and I often work with texts and really quite cerebral sort of material. And one of these texts told me the story of tarpaulin through the figure of Jack Tar. And I'm not sure how many of you have heard of Jack Tar, but I'm not English myself, but I think to an English audience, it's a very kind of characteristic figure from folklore. And the idea of Jack Tar is that it's a kind of self-made man, a sailor who is representing sort of the valors of Britishness, the sort of Victorian sense of, or Edwardian sense of Britishness from Gilbert and Sullivan and so on. But the story of this word is actually very intimately connected to the story of the fabric tarpaulin, which is tarred cloth or canvas, originally made of flax. And this is why you see these little blue flowers there. They are from a flax plant from which the original tarpaulins were actually made. And the reason why Jack Tar is called Jack Tar is because the simple sailors were not allowed to sleep in the sort of fashionable cabins, but instead had to sleep on deck under tarpaulin, under a piece of tarpaulin. And that sort of gives rise to the whole story. And in my little project that I'm going to present, which actually led to a radio program that was broadcast on Radio 4, I trace sort of the various uses of tarpaulin as a kind of metaphor, but also as real material in times of conflict. But what I want to share today is more sort of my own experience as a sort of academic venturing into the world of fabrics, and how looking at things and ideas from the point of view of material actually sort of opened up completely unexpected connections for me between people, places, and locations. So one of the ways in which I unfolded the story in the radio show is through a little fairy tale which was written by Hans Christian Andersen, which tells the story of the flax plant and how the flax plant is taken from the ground and then used to produce various kinds of materials that people use, and then when it falls out of use, it gets passed on to others. And what I enjoyed about the story was the possibility of connecting the story to a musical piece which is called Linen Flower. And the piece is supposed to convey this idea of kind of globalization, the globalizing reach of tarpaulin as a material that's used in military and also in sort of various political conflicts. But when I started working on this radio show, I realized that actually this is not really quite enough. It doesn't quite connect me to actual people or the actual fabric. So I started looking at the history of these fabrics and different conflicts. And the first step, again, being an academic, of course, the first port of call is that I went to an archive, to the National Archives in Kew Gardens. And there I found a very interesting story about the supply of tarpaulins for Russia in the Second World War. And it turned out that actually the tarpaulin connected, very different political communities. The tarpaulin was produced in British Palestine and was then shipped via agreements following the Lend-Lease program to the Soviet army, but through British mediation under the auspices of Churchill's wife, actually. So I thought that was a kind of interesting element of connecting people through fabrics. Another connection that emerged was the use of tarpaulin in Battleship Potemkin, a classic Soviet film celebrating the failed 1905 revolution through a famous scene which is called the tarpaulin scene, where evil naval officers are executing some sailors. And so the connection brought me to a reconstruction of the story of the production of tarpaulin, which brought me to a small town near Manchester where tarpaulins were produced during the Second World War, but then eventually also brought me to the refugee camp in Calais, where currently tarpaulins, at that point, tarpaulins were being used, as this man here shows, to house refugees. And so that was my story of a fabric which allowed me to not invent, not fabricate in the sense of invent, but to plot the story of statelessness in the 20th century, including wartime experiences and refugees. So when I started talking to Esme about using fabrics over brunch with our colleague Maureen McCarran, we decided that actually there's a connection here because cotton also has a story to tell. It's also global. Thank you.
So I'm also talking about a fabric, and I'm talking about cotton. And the reason why I got into thinking about cotton was that I was working on a community project with a group called the Hindu Samaj, who are there, who unfortunately can't be here today, but it was a community project that we did together. And they were asking me, as a historian of the British Empire, what connects the Peak District with British India? And so the idea was that we're used to thinking about certain cities having colonial connections. Liverpool and the slave trade, for example, is a classic example. But we're less familiar with thinking about places of the countryside as having any imperial connections. And so what we tried to do was to think about different ways in which those histories were entangled. And we returned to the theme of cotton as something that very much meshed them together. Because cotton, obviously that was spun in the Peak District mills in places like Cromford, which is Arkwright's mill, famous mill in the Peak District, was spinning cotton that came from places of enslavement, like the Americas, but also places from India. And what we did was we worked with storytellers from the South Asian community in Sheffield, particularly Devjani Chatterjee, who's a very powerful storyteller, to try and bring back memories that people had of growing up near cotton fields, of working with the cotton, of picking it, of harvesting it, and thinking about how that cotton was then spun back in Britain and how they created kind of webs of connection between India and the Peak District. So in a sense, we're also using ideas about connection, ideas about fluidity, and ideas about a material to really think cross-space and think in different spaces, and to think about the kind of politics of why that's a story that's been forgotten. So why, when we go to Cromford or we go to little Peak District villages, we're presented with such a kind of white image, and why we're kind of airbrushing and missing out thinking about colonial legacies and colonial heritage.